Hello, world historians. This is the second part of our reflections on the classical second wave civilization of China, and I wanted to focus primarily on the Qin Dynasty, which is the dynasty that lends its name to China. It's also one of the most short-lived and yet one of the most controversial and well remembered of Chinese dynasties, founded by the figure that you see here depicted in much later illustration, Qin Shi Huangdi, who essentially was able to unite China by military means, by brute force, if you like. Now, if you remember Confucius writing in the 5th century BCE, placed a great emphasis on social harmony, on the mandate of heaven, and yet, ironically, China was in a terrible state during the time of Confucius's life, and this may give us an indication as to why Confucius places this great emphasis on social harmony, on peaceful living. Qin Shi Huangdi, on the other hand, is someone who I think would have been very much at home in the power politics of the 20th and 21st century. This was a very ruthless man, probably most famous for the construction of the Great Wall of China. And in China itself today, Chinese students learn about Qin Shi Huangdi. Obviously, he's seen as a founding figure in their history, but it's also a very controversial figure, a very divisive figure. On the one hand, this extreme brutality, but on the other hand, you have this development of military infrastructure and power and domestic projects such as obviously the Great Wall of China, but also things like the great canal systems, which grew up and developed Chinese agriculture, trade, and commerce during this period. So he leaves a very mixed legacy. But it's worth pointing out that during this period, for the first time, the Confucianists, who were beginning to develop a certain power base within Chinese society, begin to be persecuted by this new regime, the Qin Dynasty. And ultimately, this is going to lead to the overthrow of the Qin Dynasty, because the perceived breach of the mandate of heaven is actually seen as a signal to the Chinese population, justifying revolution, if you like. So what you have here is this guy who takes a very hard line towards the Confucianists, particularly their idea of the mandate of heaven, which they promote. And he has not only the Confucian texts burnt, but according to many contemporary sources, he actually dug a pit in the ground and had many of the Confucian scholars thrown into the pit and buried alive. So this gives you some sort of indication as to the policy of the state at that time. And he essentially banishes the legal and philosophical ideology of Confucianism and replaces it with an idea which Western scholars refer to as legalism. But legalism is essentially the idea of the absolute power of the law, the central authority of the emperor, and everything emanates from the authoritarian rule of the emperor. And it's built upon this pessimistic view of human nature, which contrasts with Confucius's idea, which was that essentially human nature tends towards the good, and that people just have to be appealed to. Their enlightened attitudes have to be nurtured and encouraged. Whereas Qin Shi Huangdi, being perhaps more of a military-minded guy, thought that essentially people were weak, they were corrupt, they needed the strong rule of law, that violence was justified, particularly against those who broke the law. So this is basically this idea of legalism, which is introduced on a makeshift basis to replace Confucianism. So the first Qin emperor really became most associated with his public works, particularly the construction of the Great Wall of China, which involved something like 300,000 Chinese peasants who were taken from the land, conscripted essentially, and set to work in what was all but slave labor to build this wall. And of course, many of these 300,000 workers died during the construction. We also have to remember that the Great Wall of China itself is surrounded by a certain layer of mythology. The Great Wall, what we think of as the Great Wall, tends to be viewed as this sort of vacuum seal around the borders of China that was designed to help keep out people like the Mongols and earlier on, of course, the Huns. But of course, this perception is somewhat inaccurate. For one thing, ultimately it was unsuccessful in protecting the boundaries, the frontiers of China. But I think also our conception of the wall as a single construction is somewhat misleading. What we call the Great Wall of China is actually a complex of defensive and military frontiers that was built over a period not just of years but of centuries. But a recent study has concluded that, contrary to the common belief that the wall was defensive and that it was designed to keep the barbarians out of China, its main function was offensive, and it was designed to take in newly captured territory, which large numbers of Chinese peasants were now dispatched in order to begin cultivating. So this is really a reflection of the expansion of the Chinese state under Qin Shi Huangdi. And its construction continues all the way through the Ming Dynasty, which is the dynasty that succeeds the Mongol Empire in the 14th century. So we've also been looking in this class, in the previous module, on different cultural attitudes, different historical attitudes towards death and dying. And it's important to realize that the first Qin Emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, literally the first emperor of the Qin of China, believed that he could achieve immortality during this life. And this is perhaps an illustration of his hubris or his overweening pride. But he believed that by taking a compound of what was known as red mercury, he would be able to achieve immortality. Now, we happen to know that mercury is a poisonous compound, and this in fact may have shortened rather than extended his life indefinitely. But when he was buried, he surrounded himself with this earth mound and this army made up of about 7,000 life-size warriors, horses, even acrobats, entertainers, which is referred to as the Terracotta Army. Now, this was only discovered by archaeologists in the 1970s. But these figures were designed to be the guardians of the afterlife, to bring Qin Shi Huangdi after his death into the celestial realm. And so there's a certain level of irony here, because you can wonder at the great length, expenditure, and effort that went into constructing the burial mound of the Chinese emperor. But also, it's worth pointing out that the symbolic sacrifice of these 7,000 terracotta warriors compares perhaps rather more favorably to the practice of the ancient Sumerians, the Mesopotamians, who actually did in fact bury their own servants. This is the kings of ancient Sumer, their own servants, their own wives, practiced human sacrifice with the burial alive. So this is a different approach, but again, it reflects, I think, the conception of death that was held by the Chinese emperors, their notion of absolute power, the limitlessness of their ambition, and again, perhaps gives us some indication as to why, with this perception of the mandate of heaven, the Qin Empire really lasted a very short period after the death of its first emperor. So this is the final reflection on China for Module 2. But if you'll join us for the next podcast, we'll be talking about Persia, which is, of course, another of the great second wave civilizations. Thanks very much.